In a world dazzled by the silver screen, Keanu Reeves, a man whose name conjures images of quiet strength and boundless kindness, stood at the precipice of a secret that would unravel everything he believed in. It was a humid evening, the air thick with the promise of rain, when a gnawing unease drove him to action. Beneath the glow of Hollywood's spotlight, few knew that Keanu had poured his soul, and a substantial portion of his fortune, into a dream, a hospital unlike any other, a sanctuary where the downtrodden could find healing, where wealth didn't dictate worth. Yet, whispers of neglect and cruelty had begun to seep through the cracks of this noble vision, reaching him in his secluded office overlooking the restless sprawl of Los Angeles. The city lights twinkled below like a constellation of forgotten promises, and Keanu, staring out through the expansive glass, felt a storm brewing within him, a storm that demanded he uncover the truth. He had built this hospital not as a monument to his fame, but as a testament to the struggles he'd once known, the sting of being overlooked, the weight of being dismissed. Every brick, every bed, every heartbeat within those walls was meant to echo dignity, a place where the poorest soul could stand equal to the richest. But the anonymous letters piling up on his desk told a different story, tales of arrogance, of patience turned away, of a system rotting from within. Official reports painted a pristine picture, but Keanu trusted his instincts over polished lies. There was only one way to know for sure. With a resolve as unyielding as the roles he'd played, he decided to step into the shadows of his own creation, to see it not as its owner, but as a stranger in need. That night, the rumble of his old black motorcycle cut through the city's hum as he rode toward the hospital, the wind tugging at his worn jacket and faded jeans. No entourage, no cameras, just a man with a mission. The disguise was simple but effective, a weathered cap pulled low, a slouch in his usually poised frame. When he pushed through the glass doors of the emergency ward, the sterile scent of antiseptic hit him like a wave, mingling with the faint tang of desperation that hung in the air. No one spared him a second glance. The action hero who dodged bullets on screen, who'd won hearts with his humility, was now invisible, a nobody among the crowd of weary faces waiting for mercy. This isn't just a story, it's a revelation. And if you want to see how far it goes, subscribe now before it disappears. The reception area buzzed with muted chaos. A tired woman behind the desk tapped at her keyboard, her eyes glazed with indifference. Keanu approached, his voice low and steady. He asked for a consultation, offering to pay in cash, and watched as her gaze flicked over his unassuming clothes with a flicker of disdain. She handed him a slip of paper with a sigh, muttering that it'd be a long wait. He nodded, unperturbed, and took a seat between an elderly man whose breaths came in shallow rasps, and a young mother cradling a baby whose fevered whimpers pierced the air. Keanu's dark eyes scanned the room, absorbing every detail, the slump of shoulders, the quiet pleas, the way hope seemed to drain from those who lingered too long. Then he saw her, the mother, her face etched with exhaustion, rising to beg for help. Her baby's tiny body burned against her chest, his cries growing weaker by the minute. She approached the desk, voice trembling with desperation, only to be met with a curt dismissal. Rules were rules, she was told, and she'd have to wait. Keanu's fists tightened in his lap as he watched her retreat, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Beside him, the elderly man winced, clutching his chest, his pain ignored by a passing nurse who barely glanced his way. Across the room, a man in a tailored suit breezed past the desk without a number, greeted with smiles and ushered straight through. The hypocrisy unfolded like a slow-motion car crash, and Keanu felt a fire ignite within him, a fire fueled by every injustice he'd witnessed in silence. He stood, approaching the receptionist again, gesturing subtly toward the suffering around him. Couldn't something be done? Her response was sharp, her irritation palpable. Everyone had to wait, no exceptions. Keanu's gaze hardened, but he kept his composure, offering a quiet retort about rules bending for lives at stake. She scoffed, dismissing him as naive, and he returned to his seat, his mind racing. This wasn't the hospital he'd dreamed of. This was a machine, cold and unfeeling, grinding down the very people it was meant to lift up. As he sat there, the noise of the ward faded into a dull roar, and Keanu knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. Something darker awaited, something that would push him to the edge, and he was ready to face it. The fluorescent lights of the hospital buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow across the waiting room where Keanu Reeves sat, his presence still cloaked in anonymity. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken suffering, the mother rocking her feverish baby, the elderly man beside him struggling for each breath, the faint murmur of resignation rippling through the crowd. Keanu's jaw tightened as he absorbed it all, his heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the storm brewing outside. Rain had begun to lash against the windows, streaking the glass with rivulets that mirrored the tears he'd seen fall moments ago. He'd come here seeking truth, but what he'd found was a betrayal so profound it cut deeper than any wound he'd ever known. This hospital, his hospital, was a hollow shell of the sanctuary he'd envisioned, and he was determined to unearth the root of its decay. As the minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity, a new figure emerged from the chaos, striding through the ward with the confidence of a king surveying his domain. Dr. Javier Fuentes was tall and imposing, his pristine white coat a stark contrast to the disarray around him. His hair was meticulously styled, his eyes cold and piercing, and in his hand, he cradled an expensive coffee cup as if it were a scepter. He moved with an air of untouchable authority, ignoring the patients who shrank into their seats as he passed. To him, they were mere shadows, insignificant beneath the weight of his self-proclaimed importance. Keanu watched him closely, his gaze narrowing as the doctor's presence seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the room. The desperate mother, her baby's cries now reduced to faint, pitiful gasps, saw her chance. She stumbled forward, clutching her child like a lifeline, her voice cracking as she pleaded for help. The rain outside thundered louder, punctuating her words with a primal urgency. Dr. Javier paused, his head tilting slightly as if annoyed by an insect buzzing too close. He barely glanced at her, his expression twisting into a sneer of disgust as he took a deliberate sip of his coffee. His voice, when it came, was a blade, sharp and merciless. He told her to wait, dismissing her child's suffering as trivial, a nuisance not worth his time. The mother froze, her hope shattering like glass, and Keanu felt his blood surge, a molten rage coiling in his chest. He remained still, though every muscle in his body screamed to act, to shield her from this cruelty. Dr. Javier turned away, his arrogance unshaken, but the scene wasn't over. A young man burst through the entrance, his hand wrapped in a blood-soaked rag, his face pale with pain and panic. Rainwater dripped from his soaked clothes, pooling on the floor as he staggered toward the reception desk. He begged for help, his voice raw with urgency, and the receptionist directed him to Dr. Javier's office with a casual wave. Keanu leaned forward, his breath held, watching as the young man entered the lion's den. Moments later, the doctor's voice boomed through the corridor, loud enough to silence the room. He mocked the man's injury, a deep gash that stained the rag crimson, calling it a scratch, a waste of his expertise. The young man emerged seconds later, head bowed, humiliated, clutching his hand as blood seeped through his fingers. Keanu's eyes followed him, dark and unreadable, as the young man slumped into a chair nearby. Unable to sit idly any longer, Keanu rose and approached him, his movements deliberate yet gentle. He knelt beside the boy, his voice a quiet anchor in the storm. He asked to see the wound, and the young man hesitated, his eyes wide with confusion. Keanu offered a small, reassuring smile, a smile that carried the weight of 1,000 kindnesses, and pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, pressing it firmly against the gash to stem the bleeding. Across the room, Dr. Javier caught sight of the exchange, his lips curling into a smirk of amusement. He had no idea who this quiet stranger was, no inkling of the power simmering beneath that worn jacket. To him, Keanu was just another meddling fool, and if he'd known the truth, the words he spoke next might have died in his throat. The doctor sauntered closer, his coffee still in hand, and called out with a mocking lilt, suggesting Keanu leave the doctoring to the professionals. Keanu didn't flinch. He met Javier's gaze with a calm intensity that seemed to pierce through the doctor's bravado, though he said nothing. The moment hung heavy, charged with an unspoken challenge, before Javier shrugged and walked away, his laughter echoing faintly down the hall. Keanu returned his focus to the young man, tying the handkerchief into a makeshift bandage, his hands steady despite the fury roiling within him. He'd seen enough to know this wasn't just one man's cruelty. It was a symptom of something deeper, something festering in the bones of this place. As he sat back down, the rain outside intensified, hammering the windows like a drumbeat of reckoning. Keanu's mind churned, piecing together the fragments of what he'd witnessed. The staff's fear, the patient's despair, the doctor's unchecked power, it all pointed to a corruption that ran deeper than he'd feared. He needed more than outrage. He needed evidence, a clear picture of the beast he was up against. His name was finally called, a summons to face Dr. Javier one-on-one, and Keanu stood slowly, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. This was no longer just a visit. It was the beginning of a battle, one he intended to win not for himself, but for every soul this hospital had failed. The rain battered the hospital windows with relentless fury, a tempest that mirrored the storm swelling within Keanu Reeves as he rose from his seat. The call of his name, muffled and curt through the intercom, cut through the clamor of the waiting room, pulling him toward the confrontation he'd been silently preparing for. His boots left faint, wet tracks on the linoleum floor as he moved down the corridor, each step deliberate, his worn jacket swaying slightly with his stride. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting fleeting shadows that danced across his face, accentuating the lines of resolve etched deep into his features. He was no longer just an observer. He was a force, a reckoning cloaked in humility, stepping into the lion's den to face Dr. Javier Fuentes head-on. The doctor's office door loomed ahead, its frosted glass panel etched with his name in bold, authoritative letters. Keanu pushed it open without hesitation, stepping into a space that felt more like a throne room than a place of healing. The room was stark and pristine, its walls bare save for a few framed degrees that screamed prestige. Dr. Javier sat behind a sleek desk, his fingers tapping idly on a keyboard, his expensive coffee cup resting within reach. He didn't look up as Keanu entered, his boredom palpable, as if the very act of acknowledging another human being was beneath him. The air was cold, not just from the humming air conditioner, but from the chill of a man who saw patients as burdens rather than lives to be saved. Keanu stood silently for a moment, studying the doctor with an intensity that went unnoticed. When Javier finally lifted his gaze, his eyes swept over Keanu's simple attire, the faded jeans, the scuffed boots, the jacket that had seen better days, and a faint smirk tugged at his lips. His voice, when it came, dripped with condescension, a lazy drawl that carried the weight of assumed superiority. He asked what the problem was, barely masking his disinterest. Keanu's response was measured, his tone calm but firm. He'd been feeling extreme fatigue and muscle pain, he said, and wanted a thorough checkup. Javier's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement as he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. The doctor's reply was a barb wrapped in silk. He asked where Keanu was from, his tone implying that a man like him, unpolished, unassuming, didn't belong in a place like this. Keanu's eyebrow arched slightly, a subtle crack in his composed facade, but he pressed forward, questioning the relevance of the query. Javier leaned forward, his smirk morphing into a sneer, and delivered a line that struck like a thunderclap. Hospitals like this weren't for just anyone. The words hung in the air, heavy and venomous, a declaration of elitism that echoed every injustice Keanu had witnessed that night. Inside the hospital he'd built with his own hands, his own heart, he was being judged unworthy by a man who knew nothing of his truth. Silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Keanu didn't flinch, his dark eyes locking onto Javier, with a quiet ferocity that the doctor mistook for defiance. Javier sighed, as if the encounter were a tiresome chore, and reached for his stethoscope with all the enthusiasm of a man swatting a fly. He muttered for Keanu to take a deep breath, pressing the instrument to his chest with a perfunctory touch, his mind clearly elsewhere. The exam was over in moments, 3 minutes if that, before Javier scribbled a dismissive note on a form and tossed it across the desk. Painkillers and rest, he declared, his tone final as if Keanu's concerns were nothing more than a child's whining. Keanu glanced at the paper, then back at the doctor, his voice steady but edged with challenge. That was it. No tests, no questions about his history. Javier's patience snapped like a brittle twig. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he launched into a tirade about seeing dozens of patients daily, about knowing what was serious and what was mundane. Fatigue, he scoffed, was hardly worth his time. Keanu pressed further, asking the doctor to explain exactly what was wrong, his tone calm but insistent, a quiet demand for accountability. Javier's response was a dry, mocking laugh, his irritation boiling over as he waved Keanu off, claiming more important patients awaited. The implication was clear. Keanu, in his eyes, was insignificant, a speck of dust on the pristine surface of Javier's world. Keanu rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and paused at the door. He turned back, his gaze piercing through the doctor's arrogance like a blade through fog. He thanked Javier for his time, his voice low and steady, but added a final, pointed wish that the doctor treat others with more respect than he'd shown him. Javier's laughter followed, sharp and dismissive, as he demanded to know who Keanu thought he was to lecture him. Keanu offered no reply, only a faint, enigmatic smile that lingered like a promise or a threat, before stepping into the corridor and letting the door click shut behind him. The rain outside had softened to a steady patter, but the fire within Keanu burned brighter than ever. As he walked away, a young nurse darted from the shadows, her steps quick and nervous. She grabbed his arm gently, her voice a hushed whisper as she apologized for what he'd endured. Keanu turned to her, his expression softening, and asked if it was always like this. Her eyes dropped, shame coloring her features as she nodded. Javier was untouchable, she admitted, a tyrant no one dared defy. Keanu absorbed her words, the pieces of the puzzle locking into place. This wasn't just one man's hubris, it was a system shielding him, a web of complicity he'd have to dismantle. He thanked her quietly and moved on, his mind sharpening with purpose. The night wasn't over, and neither was his fight. The hospital corridor stretched before Keanu Reeves like a tunnel carved from cold reality, its sterile walls reflecting the dim glow of overhead lights that flickered with the uncertainty of the night. The rain had settled into a gentle drizzle outside, tapping against the windows like a mournful rhythm. But inside, the air was thick with the residue of the nurse's whispered confession. Dr. Javier Fuentes wasn't just a rogue tyrant, he was a symptom, a festering wound within a system that had strayed far from Keanu's vision. The weight of that truth pressed against his chest, heavier than the worn jacket clinging to his shoulders, as he moved deeper into the hospital's labyrinth. He wasn't ready to leave, not yet. He needed more than whispers. He needed the raw, unfiltered pulse of this place, the voices of those who lived its daily grind. Keanu's steps were silent but purposeful as he veered toward a less traveled wing, drawn by the faint hum of conversation seeping through a slightly ajar door. It was a break room, a cramped sanctuary where the hospital's unsung warriors, nurses, technicians, janitors, gathered to steal moments of respite. The scent of burnt coffee and antiseptic lingered as he paused just outside, his silhouette unnoticed in the shadows. Inside, the voices were low but laden with a frustration that resonated with everything he'd seen. One nurse, her tone weary yet sharp, recounted how Dr. Javier had humiliated yet another patient that day, a routine cruelty no one dared challenge. Another, younger and more hesitant, added a chilling detail. Reporting him was futile, even dangerous. Retribution came swift and subtle, cut hours, grueling shifts, fabricated reviews that crushed careers. Keanu's jaw tightened, his breath catching as a third voice confirmed the worst. Management protected Javier, shielding him like a prized asset. The doctor's efficiency, his ability to churn through cases, to keep costs low and numbers high, made him untouchable, a golden cog in a machine that prized profit over people. The words sank into Keanu like stones, each one deepening the chasm between the hospital he'd built and the one he now faced. This wasn't just negligence, it was a calculated betrayal, a corruption woven into the very fabric of the institution. He stepped forward, his presence breaking the hushed tension as the door creaked wider. The room fell silent, eyes widening in surprise at the stranger standing before them. The nurses froze, their exhaustion giving way to wariness, but Keanu raised a hand in a gesture of peace. His voice was soft, steady, cutting through the stillness as he apologized for intruding. He admitted he'd overheard their words and asked, with a quiet intensity, to know more. The eldest nurse, her face lined with years of unspoken battles, studied him for a long moment before speaking. Who was he? Keanu hesitated, the weight of his identity pressing against his tongue, but he chose truth over revelation. Not the full truth, not yet. He was just someone who believed in dignity, he said, someone who couldn't stand by while people suffered. His sincerity disarmed them, and slowly, the dam broke. They spoke of a hospital ruled by fear, where complaints vanished into bureaucratic voids, where patients were triaged not by need but by status. Javier was the spearhead, but the rot ran deeper. Administrators obsessed with metrics, policies that punished compassion, a culture that silenced dissent. Keanu listened, his dark eyes absorbing every word, every tremble of suppressed outrage. He saw it now. Firing Javier wouldn't be enough. This was a hydra, and cutting off one head would only spawn more unless he struck at its heart. The nurse's courage in speaking to him, a stranger, sparked a flicker of hope amid the bleakness, a hope he intended to nurture. Leaving the break room, Keanu returned to the waiting area, his gaze sweeping over the faces he'd come to know in his silent vigil. The elderly woman still sat there, her purse clutched like a shield, her weight stretching into hours. The young man with the bandaged hand, Keanu's handkerchief still tied around it, stared at the floor, too ashamed to ask again for help. The mother with the feverish baby rocked back and forth, her exhaustion a palpable ache. Each one was a thread in the tapestry of neglect he'd uncovered, and Keanu felt a resolve harden within him, sharp and unyielding. He couldn't walk away, not from them, not from this fight. You felt that, didn't you? That was no ordinary moment. If it hit you, hit like and let's keep going. He approached a security guard stationed near the exit, his voice calm but commanding. He requested a meeting with the hospital administrator, offering no explanation beyond a cryptic assurance that the man would want to hear him out. The guard hesitated, his brow furrowing, but something in Keanu's steady gaze compelled him to comply. A call was made, and minutes later, Keanu was escorted through a maze of hallways to a conference room that exuded authority, polished wood, high-backed chairs, a window overlooking the rain-slicked city. The administrator awaited him, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern demeanor, his arms crossed in a posture of impatience. He demanded to know what Keanu wanted, his tone clipped, as if this interruption were an affront to his carefully ordered world. Keanu sat across from him, his posture relaxed yet unyielding, and met the man's gaze with a quiet power that filled the room. The rain outside softened, a distant murmur against the silence that followed his next words. He introduced himself, Keanu Reeves, owner of this hospital, and watched as the administrator's facade crumbled. The man's face paled, his breath hitching as the weight of that name sank in. Guards shifted uncomfortably, a nurse lingering nearby gasped, but Keanu's focus never wavered. His voice remained even, a blade sheathed in velvet, as he declared that they had a serious problem, one he intended to fix, starting now. The administrator stammered, sweat beading on his brow, but Keanu leaned forward, his presence a storm breaking over the room. The truth was out, and with it, the promise of a reckoning that would shake these walls to their foundation. The conference room hung in a suspended hush, the air thick with the aftershock of Keanu Reeves' revelation. Rain streaked the expansive window behind him, a shimmering curtain that framed his silhouette against the darkened cityscape, lending him an almost mythic aura. The hospital administrator, a man accustomed to wielding authority from behind a desk piled with reports, sat frozen, his stern facade shattered by the quiet intensity of the figure before him. Keanu's words, delivered with the calm precision of a man who'd faced countless battles, both on screen and off, echoed in the stillness. He was the owner of this hospital, and he was here to fix what had gone so terribly wrong. The guards flanking the room exchanged uneasy glances, their hands twitching at their sides, while a nurse lingered in the doorway, her breath caught in a gasp she couldn't quite release. The administrator's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his fingers fumbling to adjust his collar in a futile attempt to reclaim composure. His voice, when it emerged, was a brittle thread of deference laced with panic. He stammered an apology, claiming that if he'd known Keanu was here, they'd have ensured a higher standard of care. Keanu's eyes narrowed, dark pools of restrained fury that cut through the man's excuses like a blade through mist. His response was sharp, a question that pierced the room's fragile tension. Why should he need special treatment? The administrator faltered, his words dying as he realized the trap he'd stumbled into, a trap of his own making, exposing the very inequality Keanu had come to dismantle. Leaning forward, Keanu rested his elbows on the polished table, his presence filling the space with a weight that belied his unassuming attire. His voice dropped, steady and unrelenting, as he recounted what he'd seen. The mother humiliated for begging help for her dying child, the elderly ignored in their pain, the young man dismissed with a bleeding wound. He spoke of Dr. Javier's contempt, of staff too afraid to speak, of a system that valued numbers over lives. Each word landed like a stone, building a wall of truth the administrator couldn't climb. The man's face glistened with sweat, his eyes darting as if seeking an escape, but Keanu's gaze held him fast, a quiet storm that demanded accountability. The administrator tried to rally, his voice trembling as he defended Javier, his efficiency, his ability to keep the hospital's metrics glowing in boardroom presentations. Keanu's hand rose, a simple gesture that silenced the excuses mid-flow. His tone sharpened, cutting through the bureaucratic haze. Numbers meant nothing if they came at the cost of human dignity. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his conviction, the rain outside a faint drumbeat punctuating his words. The nurse in the doorway found her courage, stepping forward with a voice shaky but resolute. She confirmed Keanu's accusations. Javier's cruelty was known, feared, and protected, a poison no one dared extract. Keanu turned to her, his expression softening with gratitude, and declared that the silencing ended tonight. Rising to his feet, Keanu's presence commanded the room like a tide pulling everything toward it. He looked to one of the guards, his voice firm but devoid of malice, and ordered Dr. Javier brought to them immediately. The guard hesitated only a moment before nodding and disappearing down the hall. The administrator sank back in his chair, defeated, while the nurse's eyes gleamed with a flicker of hope she hadn't dared feel in years. Minutes ticked by, each one a heartbeat in the tense stillness, until the doors swung open with a force that rattled the hinges. Dr. Javier strode in, his pristine coat billowing, his face a mask of irritation as he demanded to know why he'd been summoned at such an hour. His eyes landed on Keanu, and for a fleeting moment confusion creased his brow. He didn't recognize the man in the faded jacket, didn't sense the storm brewing beneath that calm exterior. He turned to the administrator, his tone sharp with entitlement, asking who this stranger was. The administrator's response came haltingly, his voice a thin whisper, the owner of the hospital. Javier's arrogance faltered, the color draining from his face as if the floor had dropped beneath him. He stammered a single word, "What?" But Keanu didn't give him time to recover. Stepping closer, his arms crossed, he fixed Javier with a gaze that burned through every layer of the doctor's bravado. Keanu's voice was a low rumble, each syllable weighted with the indignation he'd carried all night. He recounted what he'd witnessed, Javier's dismissal of the desperate mother, his mockery of the injured boy, his disdain for anyone he deemed beneath him. Javier tried to laugh it off, a nervous chuckle that crumbled under Keanu's unrelenting stare. He claimed he was just doing his job, that his numbers proved his worth, but Keanu shook his head, his words a quiet thunder. A doctor's job was to heal, not to degrade. The room held its breath as Keanu delivered his verdict. Javier was fired, effective immediately. The doctor's protests erupted, a frantic growl of disbelief, but the guards moved swiftly, flanking him as Keanu's final warning rang out. If Javier ever treated patients this way again, anywhere, Keanu would ensure he never practiced medicine again. As Javier was escorted out, his shouts fatting into the corridor, Keanu turned back to the administrator, his resolve unshaken. The changes, he declared, started now. The rain outside had ceased, leaving only the soft drip of water from the eaves, a cleansing sound that mirrored the shift within these walls. The nurse smiled, tears brimming in her eyes, and the guard stood a little taller, as if sensing the dawn of something new. Keanu's fight wasn't over. It had only begun. But in that moment, he'd struck the first blow against the darkness, a blow that promised to ripple far beyond this night. The conference room exhaled as Dr. Javier Fuentes' furious protests faded into the distance, swallowed by the hospital's labyrinthine corridors. The air felt lighter, as if a suffocating veil had been lifted, though the damp scent of rain still clung to the edges of the space, seeping through the windowpane. Keanu Reeves stood at the center of it all, his presence a quiet pillar amid the storm he'd unleashed. The administrator slumped in his chair, his authority stripped bare, while the nurse lingered near the door, her tear-streaked face glowing with a fragile hope. The guards, once rigid with uncertainty, now watched Keanu with a mix of awe and anticipation, their postures subtly shifting to align with the man who just rewritten the rules of this broken world. Outside, the night had settled into a stillness that felt almost reverent, the city's pulse slowing as if to bear witness to the transformation unfolding within these walls. Keanu's voice broke the silence, steady and resolute, as he turned his gaze back to the administrator. The changes he demanded weren't suggestions. They were a mandate, a blueprint for redemption he intended to see through. He outlined his vision with precision: an anonymous reporting system to root out abuse, mandatory training in empathy and patient care for every employee, a culture where dignity wasn't a privilege but a right. His words carried the weight of a promise forged in the fires of what he'd seen: the mother's tears, the young man's shame, the elderly's silent suffering, and he would not let them be forgotten. The administrator nodded, his resistance crumbling under the force of Keanu's conviction. He muttered in agreement, his voice hollow, knowing full well that defiance was no longer an option. The nurse stepped forward, her hands clasped as if in prayer, and asked if this was truly possible. Could a place so steeped in neglect become a beacon of compassion? Keanu met her gaze, his eyes softening with a warmth that belied the steel beneath. He assured her it was, and they'd do it together. Her smile widened, a dam breaking as tears spilled freely, and for the first time that night, the room felt alive with possibility. Word of Javier's ousting spread like wildfire through the hospital, a whisper that grew into a roar as staff and patients alike caught wind of the upheaval. Nurses who'd cowered under his reign exchanged tentative glances, their shoulders straightening as fear gave way to relief. In the waiting room, the elderly woman looked up from her purse, sensing a shift she couldn't yet name, while the young man with the bandaged hand flexed his fingers, the sting of humiliation beginning to fade. Keanu left the conference room, his steps echoing with purpose as he walked back through the corridors, his dark eyes scanning the faces he passed. He didn't seek their recognition. He sought their trust, their belief that this place could be more than a machine of indifference. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital began to breathe anew. The anonymous reporting system took root, a lifeline for those who'd been silenced too long. Complaints trickled in at first, then surged, tales of neglect, of petty tyrannies, of a system that had favored efficiency over humanity. Keanu oversaw it all from afar, his office once again his vantage point over the city, but now his focus was razor-sharp on the institution he'd reclaimed. Training sessions rolled out, led by experts who taught not just procedure but heart, how to listen, how to see the person behind the chart. Staff grumbled at first, resistant to change, but Keanu's quiet presence during one session, sitting among them as a learner rather than a lord, softened their skepticism into something like pride. The mother with the feverish baby returned one crisp morning, her child now rosy-cheeked and giggling, cradled in her arms as she sought a follow-up. She was greeted not with sighs but with smiles, ushered to a room where a doctor knelt to her son's level, speaking gently as he checked his vitals. The young man with the wounded hand came back too, his injury properly stitched and healing, his eyes bright with a gratitude he didn't need to voice. Keanu watched these moments from the sidelines, often disguised in his weathered cap and jacket, blending into the crowd to ensure the changes held. He saw nurses linger with patients, heard laughter where there'd once been only groans, felt the air hum with a purpose that matched his own. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Keanu stood outside the hospital, its facade glowing softly against the twilight. The glass doors reflected a man who'd fought not for glory but for justice, a man who turned his pain into a gift for others. He pulled his motorcycle helmet from under his arm, the familiar weight grounding him, and prepared to ride back into the night. But before he could, a small figure darted from the shadows, a boy no more than 5, his bright eyes wide with curiosity. He tugged at Keanu's sleeve, his voice a chirp of innocence as he asked if this was Keanu Reeves, the owner who'd made the doctors nice. Keanu knelt, his smile genuine and unguarded, and confirmed it with a nod. The boy beamed, thanking him for helping people, his tiny hand warm against Keanu's calloused one. Keanu ruffled the child's hair, his throat tightening as he replied that taking care of people was what mattered most. He rose, watching the boy scamper back to his mother, and turned his gaze to the hospital once more. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was alive, its heart beating in time with his own. The engine of his motorcycle roared to life, a sound that carried him into the dusk, but the echo of that night's victory lingered, a promise that the fight for compassion was far from over. The growl of Keanu Reeves' motorcycle faded into the twilight, swallowed by the sprawling expanse of Los Angeles as the city settled into the soft embrace of night. The hospital stood behind him, its lights a constellation of renewed hope against the darkening sky, a testament to the battle he'd waged and won, but not without scars. Weeks had passed since that rain-soaked night when he'd torn through the veil of corruption, and though the air within those walls now carried whispers of kindness where despair once reigned, Keanu knew the war for his vision was far from its final chapter. The boy's innocent gratitude lingered in his mind, a spark that fueled his resolve as he rode through streets slick with the memory of storms, the wind tugging at his jacket like a call to keep pushing forward. Back in his office, high above the city's restless pulse, Keanu sat with a stack of reports that told a story of transformation and resistance. The anonymous reporting system had become a floodgate, unleashing a torrent of truths the hospital's old guard had buried deep. Nurses spoke of lingering cliques loyal to Javier's legacy, administrators grumbled about the cost of empathy training, and a few doctors, those who'd thrived in the shadows of the old regime, pushed back with subtle defiance. Keanu's dark eyes scanned the pages, his fingers tracing lines of data that showed patient satisfaction rising, wait times shrinking, yet a stubborn undercurrent of skepticism persisted. He leaned back, the city lights flickering beyond the glass like a mirror to his thoughts, and felt the weight of what lay ahead. Change was a seed he'd planted, but rooting out the weeds would take more than one night's reckoning. He decided to return, not as a shadowed observer this time, but as a visible force, a reminder of the promise he'd made. The next morning, the sun blazed low and golden, casting long shadows as Keanu pulled his motorcycle into the hospital lot. He wore no disguise now, his presence unguarded, the familiar leather jacket a symbol of the man who'd walked among them unseen. Staff paused as he entered, their murmurs rippling through the halls like a breeze through dry grass. Some nodded in quiet respect, others averted their eyes, unsure of what his return meant. Keanu moved with purpose, his boots echoing on the polished floor, heading not to the conference room but to the heart of the hospital, the wards where patients lived the reality of his reforms. In the pediatric wing, he found a scene that stopped him cold. A young girl, her hair a cascade of curls, sat propped against pillows, her frail frame dwarfed by the bed. A nurse knelt beside her, reading from a tattered book, her voice a gentle melody that coaxed a smile from the child's pale lips. Keanu lingered in the doorway, unseen, as the nurse tucked a blanket around the girl with a tenderness that spoke of more than duty. This was his dream made flesh, a moment of connection untainted by the cold metrics that had once ruled. The nurse glanced up, catching his eye, and offered a shy nod before returning to her story. Keanu's chest tightened, a quiet pride swelling within him, but he knew this was just one thread in a tapestry still being woven. He moved on, drawn to the emergency ward where his journey had begun. The waiting room was quieter now, its chaos tempered by a new rhythm. Patients sat with numbered tickets, their faces weary but patient, attended by a receptionist whose tone carried warmth instead of weariness. Keanu watched as an elderly man approached the desk, his cane tapping a slow beat, and was met with a smile and a promise of swift care. Nearby, a doctor, young, earnest, a stark contrast to Javier's arrogance, crouched beside a woman clutching her arm, listening intently as she described her pain. The air hummed with a purpose Keanu had longed to see, yet he couldn't shake the sense that beneath this surface calm, shadows still lurked. His instincts proved right. Later, in a staff meeting he'd called, tension simmered. Keanu stood at the front of a packed room, his presence a quiet command as he addressed nurses, doctors, and administrators alike. He praised their progress, the lives touched, the trust rebuilt, but urged them to dig deeper, to confront the resistance he'd sensed in the reports. A veteran doctor, his hair streaked with silver and his posture rigid with pride, rose to challenge him. The man's voice was smooth but edged with disdain, questioning the practicality of Keanu's ideals. Empathy was noble, he said, but efficiency kept the lights on. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, a faint echo of the old regime's logic. Keanu didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto the doctor, and spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. Efficiency without heart, he said, was a hollow victory. A machine could count numbers, but only people could heal souls. He recounted the girl in the pediatric ward, the elderly man at reception, the moments of humanity that defined this hospital's true worth. The doctor sat, his argument deflated, and Keanu pressed on, announcing a new initiative. Patient advocates, voices for the voiceless, to ensure no one fell through the cracks again. The room buzzed with a mix of awe and unease, but Keanu saw the tide turning, the seeds of doubt giving way to a tentative belief. As the meeting ended, a janitor approached him, his hands rough from years of labor, his eyes bright with something like reverence. He thanked Keanu for the changes, for the respect now afforded even the lowest ranks, for the chance to work with pride. Keanu clasped the man's shoulder, his smile genuine, and felt the echo of that boy's gratitude from days before. He left the hospital that evening, the sun sinking into a horizon ablaze with promise, knowing the fight wasn't over. The weeds of resistance remained, but so did his resolve, and with it, the resilience of those he'd inspired to stand with him. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing Lowe's angels in a golden glow that softened the city's sharp edges as Keanu Reeves stepped out of the hospital, his silhouette framed against the fading light. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and the distant hum of traffic, a symphony of life that pulsed in time with the transformation he'd set in motion. Weeks had unfurled since his return, since that charged meeting where he'd faced down resistance and planted the seeds of a new era. Now, as spring edged towards summer in late March 2025, the hospital stood as a living testament to his unwavering will, a beacon not just of healing but of humanity reclaimed. Yet, Keanu knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, a legacy he'd fight to sustain. Inside those walls, the changes had taken root with a vigor that surprised even him. The patient advocates he'd envisioned now roamed the wards, their clipboards and compassionate ears ensuring no plea went unheard. One, a middle-aged woman with a quiet strength, had already uncovered a backlog of neglected cases. Elderly patients shuffled aside, children whose symptoms were dismissed, and brought them to light with a tenacity that mirrored Keanu's own. Nurses, once bound by fear, now moved with a confidence born of purpose, their hands steady as they stitched wounds, their voices soft as they soothed fears. The receptionist who'd once sighed at the desperate mother now greeted each face with a warmth that turned strangers into neighbors. Keanu walked the halls one final time that evening, his presence no longer a secret but a quiet force that inspired rather than commanded. In the emergency ward, he paused to watch a scene unfold. A teenage girl, her ankle swollen from a fall, sat with her father, her eyes wide with pain. A doctor, not the young one from before but a seasoned woman with a gentle demeanor, knelt beside her, explaining the X-ray with patience, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. The father nodded, relief washing over his face, and Keanu felt a swell of pride, not for himself but for them, for the system they'd rebuilt together. This was what he dreamed of, a place where every soul mattered, where the invisible were seen. He ventured to the pediatric wing, drawn by the memory of the girl with the curls. She was there still, her bed now adorned with drawings taped to the wall, bright splashes of color that spoke of recovery. The same nurse sat beside her, a different book in hand, her voice weaving a tale of dragons and courage. The girl giggled, her laughter a melody that danced through the room, and Keanu lingered in the doorway, unseen, letting the sound wash over him. It was a victory small in scale but vast in meaning, a reminder that the fight for dignity wasn't won in grand gestures alone, but in these quiet, fragile moments. Outside, the hospital grounds buzzed with a subtle energy. Staff gathered in clusters during breaks, their conversations no longer hushed with dread but alive with ideas, ways to improve, to reach further. The janitor who'd thanked him weeks ago waved from across the lot, pushing a cart with a stride that carried pride. Keanu returned the gesture, his smile faint but genuine, and felt the threads of connection weaving tighter. The old guard's resistance had withered, outmatched by a tide of belief that swelled with each life touched. Reports on his desk now glowed with metrics he could stand behind, shorter waits, higher recoveries, a trust that drew patients from beyond the city's borders. As night deepened, Keanu climbed onto his motorcycle, the engine's rumble a familiar comfort against the stillness. He rode through the streets, the wind tugging at his jacket, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white. His mind drifted to the boy who'd thanked him, to the girl's laughter, to the countless faces he'd never known but whose lives he'd altered. The hospital wasn't perfect, perfection was a myth, but it was alive, its heart beating with a compassion he'd fought to restore. He thought of the anonymous letters that had sparked this journey, now replaced by notes of gratitude that piled on his desk, each one a brick in the foundation of something enduring. He pulled to a stop atop a hill overlooking the city, the hospital a distant glow against the sprawl below. Dismounting, he stood there, helmet in hand, the night air cool against his skin. The stars above winked through the haze, and Keanu felt a rare peace settle over him, a peace born not of completion but of purpose fulfilled. He'd built this place to honor the struggles he'd known, to give others the dignity he'd once craved, and now it stood as more than a building. It was a legacy, a light that would shine long after he rode into the shadows. The motorcycle roared to life once more, carrying him into the night, but the echo of his work remained, a ripple that would spread far beyond these walls. Keanu Reeves, the man who'd walked unseen among the broken, had left behind a truth as unyielding as his spirit. Respect and compassion were free, but their absence cost everything. And in this hospital, at last, they flowed like a river, unstoppable, eternal, a gift from a heart that refused to let the world forget. If you enjoyed this story, there's another video on screen right now. Go ahead and give it a look for an even more astonishing tale. And don't forget, we'll have many more uplifting and dramatic stories coming your way. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, that way you'll never miss our newest uploads.